We're really glad to have you here for this webinar, a very important topic. Let me go right ahead and introduce our speaker for this important topic today on sanctions and the impact they have in terms of global events. Narges Bajoghli is a scholar, public intellectual, and award-winning author whose work explores the intersections of media, power, and resistance in global politics. She serves as the faculty lead of Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies and is the co-director of the Rethinking of Iran Initiative. Her recent book, How Sanctions Work in Iran, offers an in-depth analysis of the impact of sanctions on Iranian society. Narges's forthcoming book, Workshop of War, examines the legacy of chemical warfare in the Middle East and its broader implications for global military experimentation and violence. Her research and writing have been featured in prominent outlets, including Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and the Atlantic. She's a frequent commentator on issues such as sanctions, resistance movements, and the role of media in shaping political ideologies. Her graphic novella, Sanctioned Lives, visually captures the everyday realities of life under sanctions and is part of a broader transmedia project bringing critical discussions of sanctions to new audiences. So we welcome you very much to our table, and thanks. You're delighted to hear about how sanctions work and its impact in Iran. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lynn, for having me and for Mike as well. And I hope you're all well. And thank you for joining at a time that I know where everyone's attention is sort of taken in a million different directions. So sanctions are a topic that seem to always be in the news, but what I found both myself in studying them and then later talking to audiences after we did our research and writing of our book is that sanctions are actually something that, although it seems to be very prevalent, we know very, very little about. And we know very little about how they actually work in targeted societies. So let me start out with this fact that according to the U.S. Department of Treasury's own accounting, which they did in 2021, U.S. sanctions have increased by over 900% since the start of the 21st century. So in the past quarter century, or the first 25 years of our current century, U.S. sanctions have increased at a rate much higher than pretty much any other kind of foreign policy tool we have. Today, sanctions are the primary foreign policy tool of the United States. And yet, as I mentioned, we really actually don't know very much about how sanctions work in the societies in which they are targeted. Sanctions were created in the aftermath of World War I, and they were created because policymakers and politicians and leaders across Europe were looking around at the carnage that World War I had produced and were thinking that there had to be a different way to deal with international crises and with quote unquote rogue nations that would not lead to the amount of death and destruction that that World War I did. And so sanctions were created as a way of putting economic pressure on societies and on countries that were acting in ways that needed to be sort of fixed. And the idea was, as Woodrow Wilson said at the time, that sanctions were a silent but deadly weapon, that its implementation would cause such suffocation, these are the words that he used, would cause such suffocation that no other nation would do things to come under economic sanctions. And yet we saw after the implementation of maximum pressure sanctions during the first Trump administration on Iran, Russia invaded Ukraine, knowing full well that it would come under a whole slew of new economic sanctions. So economic sanctions, although they may have had a deterrent effect in the aftermath of World War I, the more that they've been used, the more that we're seeing that they actually don't act as a deterrent any longer. And so in this kind of context, we are now seeing not only the proliferation of U.S. economic sanctions, but also from the sides of places like Iran, Russia, China, and now other countries that are currently not under sanctions, but but are afraid that one day they might be, you are now seeing mechanisms that are being developed to bypass the US dollar, which will have an impact further down the road. So let me first break it down about what it is that sanctions are, what they do, and then sort of the blowback effects of sanctions. So sanctions are supposed to do two primary things. They're either supposed to put enough pressure on a governing establishment of a targeted society that it forces that government to change behavior. Or if that does not work, it's supposed to put enough pressure on the population of a targeted society that forces them to either rise up in protest or put enough pressure on their ruling elites to force change, behavioral change. Now, what we've seen in countries that we have studied, our book was specifically about Iran, but since the book has come out, I've been leading research teams that are looking at economic sanctions pretty much across the world. And at this point, US economic sanctions target about 1/3 of the countries in the world, most of them predominantly poor countries. And so we've been looking with researchers at the consequences of these sanctions across different contexts. And what we found is that for the vast majority of these cases, economic sanctions do not actually force the ruling elite to change behavior. And when populations do rise up because the economic situation has gotten harder under sanctions, they're actually met with much harsher repression than before. Now, let me break this down about why this may be. First of all, many of the countries that come under US economic sanctions are countries that, at the heart of their political culture, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, but at the heart of their political culture, they believe that the United States is bullying them through economic sanctions. And so they are not going to put their hands up in the air and say, "We're so sorry, the US, we made you mad. Let us come to the negotiation table." Instead, what they end up doing is they start to figure out ways to bust through sanctions, which means essentially figure out ways to do trade and have trade continue to come in and out of their borders. And the other part of this is that economic sanctions are not just an economic tool. So it's not just that a country it becomes even more difficult to trade with that country on an international market, but countries that come under especially comprehensive economic sanctions from the United States, there's also a whole slew of other policies that are in effect, which include things like covert operations, overt operations, cyber warfare, media and psyops operations. And so these countries understand, or the political leaders of these countries view economic sanctions as a form of warfare, not only just economic warfare, but warfare more broadly with the United States. And so they begin to clamp down in this way. The intel apparatuses of these countries comes to the forefront of almost all political decision making. So let's take the case of Iran, for example. With the implementation of this maximum pressure sanctions under the first Trump administration, we saw a huge shift in those who came to the forefront of political power in Iran. And that went from the political class to the intelligence class, because economic and comprehensive economic sanctions are shadow warfare. This is how they understand it, right? And shadow wars are intelligence wars first and foremost. So the intelligence apparatus of a country comes to the forefront of all political decision making. And then that kind of political culture deeps down all the way into how they deal with their own domestic population. So when you do have uprisings like you did in Iran in 2017, 2018, related directly to the economic situation in the country, or in Cuba in 2021, in Venezuela also around the same time, because they were also under maximum pressure sanctions during the first Trump administration. You have uprisings, and the way in which the political state deals with these uprisings is that they crush them as if the population is enacting a form of what they would call a velvet revolution, right? A form of a revolution that is meant to be in political line with US policies. And so they begin to view their own population even increasingly more than before. These are all authoritarian states, so they've all been enacting in authoritarian ways with their populations, but they begin to, under increasingly sanctioned regimes, treat their populations as if this is a much deeper sort of intel operation that is being waged upon the state. So what we see happening in this is that the political establishment of the targeted state actually becomes much more authoritarian the more that you see sanctions sort of continue and elongate. Now, the other part of this equation is that sanctions across any state that you are looking at predominantly impact the middle classes and the poor. So it drives the middle class into poverty and it drives the poor into even deeper poverty. Why is that? Because when sanctions are imposed on a society, that essentially means that doing trade with that country becomes, in some cases, completely illegal, and other cases, very difficult to do because of all the regulations in place. Now, as I mentioned before, countries like Iran, for example, or Russia, or Cuba, or Venezuela, or all of these other countries that have been under sanctions, they're not going to say, okay, the U.S. doesn't want trade to happen with us, therefore we're going to put our hands in the air. Instead, they try to figure out ways to bust through those sanctions. In a sanctioned economy, something like, let's say, trade that you would do to get in fiberglass into your country would be, for example, I'm just making these numbers up, but 20 cents to get a certain amount in your country. In a sanctioned economy, that becomes 100, 200% added value to that trade. And so all of a sudden now, the only entities that are able to trade in a sanctioned economy are those that have the political capital and that, more importantly, the economic capital to be able to trade at increased prices, because all of the trade in a sanctioned economy begins to slide into the gray and black markets. So what this means for a country like Iran is that the independent business sector begins to be iced out of trade. And because after a while, it no longer has the capital, the money to be able to pay these increased prices on the international markets. Who has the money to be able to continue trade into a country like that is the military and political establishments. So under almost every sanctioned regime that we have looked at, sanctions over a long term actually balloon the wealth of the military and political establishments while simultaneously driving the middle and lower middle classes into poverty. So it creates this really uneven impact. Sanctions are supposed to actually be impacting the political and military elite. And many of the sanctions are targeted towards individuals in the political and military elite. But because of the fact of sanctions busting, it actually ends up doing the reverse. So in places like Tehran, for example, or other major cities in Iran, you now have the construction of major luxury malls, luxury apartment buildings, luxury cars, because the political and military elite are now flushed with cash for a couple of reasons. One, under sanctions busting, the economy gets driven into black and gray markets, which means that a lot of the trade that is happening is either being done in cryptocurrency or in cash. And there's a lot of corruption endemic in this because you are attempting to trade in a market where it's illegal for you to do so. So then, therefore, you need to pay extra. People pocket the cash. There's a lot of corruption that's happening. And the military elite is also in charge of the borders of a country. So they get to determine what comes in and out and who has the ability to trade in and out of a country. That means that they're also receiving kickbacks in that kind of environment. So the military and political elite are flush with cash in an environment like this, and then they need to wash their money. So they wash their money through luxury buildings, through luxury cars, and then obviously through things like the cultural sector, the music sector, the fine arts sector, right? Like if anyone knows the history of how the music industry was created in the United States, that was because the mafia needed to wash their money, and it creates this entire industry to do so. Fine arts kind of functions as that across the globe in many instances, that it becomes a way of washing money that needs to be made clean. So in a space like this, that is one of the main things that's happening that is leading to the political and economic elite actually becoming ever more wealthy under a sanctioned regime. This also means that many within the political and military elites actually then, because they've been made so wealthy under a sanctioned regime, end up not wanting or end up sort of becoming a sanctions mafia. So you have, because sanctions create an entire new network of trade on an international market, again, because you have to go into the black and gray market. So it's a different kind of trade and a different level of networking that needs to happen than trade that's on the books. So you have created within all of these sanctioned countries a knowledge production about how sanctions can be busted, which is why when Russia came under the severe amount of sanctions with the invasion of Ukraine, you had Russian think tanks, policymakers, business people flying to Tehran and paying attention also to the ways in which Iran was busting through sanctions in order to be able to create some of those trade routes and some of the ways in which sanctions are busted. This also means that one of the things that is happening, for example, right now is that Iran and Russia are creating trade routes that completely bypass the US dollar. They're investing in actual transportation routes that are able to get goods in and out of both countries, as well as being a facilitator for trade in other states that don't want to be using the US dollar. And so that is creating actual facts on the ground for sanctions busting in these kinds of instances. So that's on the level of the state. And then on the level of the society, you have situations in a place like Iran, as well as some of these other sanctioned countries, in which the more that sanctions are on the books, the more that the population becomes dependent on the state in order to make ends meet. So, in a situation like Iran's in particular, in which you have a society that has been embroiled in uprisings against the state for decades now, you actually have a situation in which the middle classes, which are essentially the forces for change in societies around the world, right? It's not the poor that that create revolutions, mostly because the poor can't necessarily afford to be on the streets and having revolutionary uprisings. It's usually the middle classes. And this is especially the case in a place like Iran. It was the middle classes that created the 1979 revolution. It's the middle classes that have been at the forefront of all of the uprisings against the Islamic Republic. So now the middle classes have increasingly been driven into poverty, and that means that they cannot have sustained strikes, for example. So when there was an uprising in 2022 and 2023 with the Women Life Freedom uprising, with women taking off their mandatory veils, they were calling for sustained strikes during that uprisings. And there were a lot of folks who wanted to support that, but they literally could not strike for more than a few days because they needed that money to be able to buy things to put on the tables for their families. And so in instances like this, what you end up seeing is that the population actually ends up becoming more dependent on the state for handouts, for help to make it to the end of the month and all of those kinds of things. And that is something that actually, under a prolonged sanctions regime, making the society more dependent on the state, actually, in many ways, it sort of rolls back the intended consequences of what sanctions are supposed to do. So oftentimes the question is asked in Washington, do sanctions work or not? And one of the things that we found in our research for our book and in the research that we conducted at the SAIS Rethinking Iran Initiative at Johns Hopkins University is that we brought together over 16 researchers from around the world to look at different aspects of ways in which the sanctions were impacting different levels of society in Iran, from the economy to the environment to the medical sector to power structures, sort of all across the board. And the things that we found in those studies is that not only does the population sort of become more dependent on the state, but that it creates sort of these everlasting and cycles of crises, right? Now, the question in Washington tends to be, do sanctions work? And what we found is that that's actually the wrong question to ask. The better question to ask is, how do sanctions work? Because when you have a country with the size, the power and the size of the United States and the power of the US dollar, of course, sanctions work. Like they do they produce ripple effects in any state in which sanctions are implemented. So of course there are things that sanctions do, but what is the work that they do, right? And do they work in the ways that they are supposed to? And in the case of Iran, which is one of the sort of key case studies to look at, because Iran has been under some form of sanctions or another for the past 46 years. And by the time that we were writing the book and right before this Russia sanctions, it was the most sanctioned country in the world. So it becomes this really important case study to look at and to sort of understand what's the longue durée of sanctions and what has it produced. Now, not only has it sort of ballooned the wealth of the military and economic elite in Iran, but also sanctions were meant to be a form of policymaking that would not lead to warfare, right? That would sort of be an alternative to war, like I mentioned when they were first created in the aftermath of the First World War. However, sanctions on Iran in particular, and as we see across the Middle East, have become a cause for warfare. They're actually becoming a cause for conflict rather than a deterrent against it. Iran, as well as its allies in the region, and what used to be called the so-called axis of resistance, they are all under one form of sanctions or another. So that is something to keep in mind. And one of the ways that I think about it after having studied it for so long is that sanctions become another form of forever warfare from on our end. And they sort of solidify conflict into the long term. Now, why is that? Because sanctions actually, the United States were really, really good at putting on sanctions and we're really bad at taking sanctions off. We actually don't know how to do it very well. So one of the lessons that the Iranian leadership learned in the aftermath of the Iran deal that the Obama administration negotiated is that even under the Obama administration, before Trump pulled out of that deal, the Obama administration was not able to lift any more than maybe 20% of the sanctions on Iran. And the reason for that is because sanctions are actually spread out across different agencies in the US government. So the executive branch can take off certain sanctions, but if a country is also under sanctions under, for example, the State Department, or congressional sanctions, those are really difficult sanctions that get taken off, right? Because that's a different arm of the US government, and the executive does not have as much authority over that. I mean, did not. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But the broader point is that what the lessons that Iran's policymakers and leaders learned from the Iran deal under the Obama administration is that the United States actually does not have the ability to take US sanctions off. Other countries have also been looking at this, at the case of Iran, at the case of Serbia before, where it actually, even once there was regime change in Serbia, the sanctions did not come off until it took years for those sanctions to come off, even after regime change. In the Iraq case during the 1990s, for example, Iraq was under very, very heavy UN sanctions as well as other US sanctions. Those sanctions did not come off until there was a military invasion and there was regime change in that way. So the sanctions regimes are such that we're really good at putting them on, but we're not very good at taking them off. And so that means that countries are understanding that once you go under US sanctions, you're probably not coming off of them. Or even if you come off of them, it's only a certain amount that's very little, and it's not the degree that you need for your economy to bounce back. Now, that might seem like it's not such a big deal, except that when it comes to negotiations, it's a really big deal because sanctions act as sticks and we don't have a carrot. Right. So right now, and we're going to see actually what happens with the negotiations that are taking place between Russia and the United States that have just started over the Ukraine war. And we're going to see what the Trump administration is going to do about this. But one of the things that Russia is going to want is some kind of sanctions relief. And we're going to have to see how the Trump administration is able to pull this off, because in previous administrations, we have not been able to see the pulling off of sanctions in a lot of these different circumstances. Now, that goes back to some of the reasons in which this happens is because sanctions sanctions are just words on a piece of paper. That's all they are. And if you've ever read sanctions policy or sanctions regulations, which are really difficult to discern, they come out every Friday on the Department of Treasury's OFAC, Office of foreign assets control. You can look it up, try to read some of the sanctions announcements if you haven't. Sometimes, and I study this stuff, I want to bang my head on a wall when I read it. It's so difficult to understand because sanctions policy and sanctions regulations are written by lawyers and by financiers, like bankers or folks in the finance world. And so understanding that language is a very difficult thing, and oftentimes they're written in very vague ways on purpose. So in that kind of circumstance, what it means is that sanctions only go into effect when they are now embedded within an entire sanctions industry. So as I mentioned before, sanctions have increased about 900% in the United States since the start of the 21st century. So now we have an entire industry of compliance officers that are embedded in every single multinational corporation and bank around the world. So what this means is that, for example, even a country that comes under for targeted human rights sanctions, like Sudan, for folks who were in charge of the genocide in Darfur, which seems like a very good idea. Like those folks need to be sanctioned, right? That's one place where sanctions makes a ton of sense to be able to do. But as researchers that we're working with now in South Sudan are showing us, that even in a targeted sanctions regime like the one on South Sudan, in actuality, because sanctions have become such a large thing, no multinational corporation or bank or insurance company will even want to do trade with South Sudan, with the fear that if they do and and there is one person on the board of one of these companies that might be tied to the targeted sanctions regime, then they either lose access to the United States or come under very heavy fines. So even though South Sudan is not like Iran, Iran is under comprehensive sanctions, South Sudan has these targeted sanctions, but in actuality, those targeted sanctions end up functioning exactly like comprehensive sanctions. So what we've done is we've created an entire apparatus of sanctions around us, and we weaponize the dollar. And this is part of, actually, President Trump has been talking about this, and he tweeted about it prior to becoming elected, which is that the new formation of BRICS, and in their last summit, they talked about the desire to move away from trading in the US dollar. Now, when we weaponize the US dollar in the way that we have through sanctions and then now potentially through tariffs under President Trump, one of the things that we're seeing is that more and more countries want to begin to either trade in local currencies or to find mechanisms to trade around the dollar. The weaponization of the dollar is actually a blowback effect of sanctions onto us. So prior to this, we used to think that sanctions are an easy tool because we don't have to put boots on the ground, and we sort of kick the can down the road on foreign policy issues that we either don't want to deal with at the moment or we're going to sort of deal with later. For example, Iran, or Navalny is killed, and then we put 250 Russians on a sanctions list, and we're like, okay, it plays well to a domestic audience because those are the headlines, but we're going to push the can down the road because we actually can't do anything about that issue. Well, now we're finding that the more that we're doing things like that, there are now mechanisms and, more importantly, discourses around the world to find ways to trade that bypass the US dollar. That is going to have a huge repercussion on the power of the United States and the US dollar around the world, not tomorrow, not next week, but 5 years down the line and 10 years down the line. The more that we weaponize the dollar, the more the likelihood starts to become that it's not going to be the main currency for trade because it has become so weaponized. And I think I'm at the 30-minute mark, and I would love to have this be much more of a conversation. So I'm just going to pause there, and I'm happy to take the questions to dive into any part of this.
Mike?
You're up, Lynn.
Okay.
Make your announcements.
Just want to briefly, thanks for that, Narj. That was just fabulous, and we're looking forward to the Q&A coming up. Just some announcements coming up. Tomorrow, February 20th, we're having a live meeting where Ann Calvarasi Barr, who's the former Inspector General of USAID, is talking about her experience as oversight of government programs and funds domestic and international structures and challenges, and of course, all the stuff that's going on with USAID. It ought to be a very interesting meeting, and that's going to be at the McGlynn Center, starting at 11:30 and ending probably around 1 o'clock. And we had to postpone that from last week due to weather problems. Just so you know, for next month, March 12th, for International Women's Day, which is actually March 8th, but on March 12th, we're going to have a Zoom to a live audience meeting for International Women's Day. Linda Robinson Sr., who's a fellow for women and foreign policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, has constructed with her group a thing known as the Women's Power Index. And she'll be talking about the status of women's global leadership around the world. So we look forward to seeing you at both of those events. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Mike and our speaker.
All right, getting off to a slow start with the chat. We've had some problems with the people getting into the webinar, I'm told. So we're redirecting them to Facebook. Haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, so maybe somebody could just put a question in the chat so we can see that. My first question is about tariffs. So sanctions generally, aid payments, restricting financial transactions, trade embargoes, travel bans, things like that. But we hear a lot about tariffs and how it's going to make us all this money. But my understanding is that tariffs aren't one country paying another country money. It's actually a tax on imports, which reduces supply, and presumably would raise prices both because of the reduced supply and because of the increased taxes on domestic companies and consumers. Is that correct? Or am I crazy here?
No, you're not crazy. It's correct. And the way in which the Trump administration is talking about and enforcing tariffs is again a continuation of the same logic of the weaponizing of the US dollar, right? So for me, it's really fascinating because he'll talk about the implementation of tariffs and then in the same breath talk about if BRICS continues to try to find ways of trading around the US dollar, we're going to ruin their economies and we're going to put more tariffs and more sanctions on them. It's a really interesting conundrum here because it's still, even though Trump himself actually in really interesting ways has said that sanctions don't work, he's one of the only presidents I've seen say something like this. In the same vein, he's actually also weaponizing the US dollar through tariffs. And so the logic of both of them seem to be very similar to me. And I think we're going to have to wait and see how it plays out. But the way that I see the two tied together is really this way in which he is relying upon and touting out the threat of tariffs because, again, of the power of the US dollar. But the more that we do things like that, the more that no country in their right mind is going to want to have their economy topsy-turvy the way Venezuela's has, or the way Iran's has, or the way that a lot of these other countries have. And so they're going to look for ways to either diversify their trading partners or start to trade in other ways that are not the US dollar.
Yeah, because certainly there's pressure there if you're reducing a company's exports, but it feels a little more indirect, right? Because then they're going to be looking for other trade opportunities.
Exactly.
Okay, so our chat is working. A question from Jody Alder for now. I think this is actually a question from the students because Jody is a teacher at one of our schools, and she told me she was going to be watching from someplace else. So I'm going to guess it's her students who are watching. What can America do other than sanctions to impede other countries and encourage them to change?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of our work on this book and just sort of on this research is not to, I'm not naive. Sanctions are not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, they can't because it's a tool that we've invested so much in, and it's sort of one of the main foreign policy tools we have. So I don't see it phasing out in the horizon anytime soon. Part of what we're trying to do, though, is two things. One is that sanctions are the most prominent foreign policy tool that we are using today, and yet we hardly ever talk about it. We don't know what sanctions are doing. We don't understand how sanctions are impacting targeted societies. We don't even know if we're able to get to our policy objectives through sanctions. A lot of that is a black box for most Americans. And for me as an anthropologist, that was a really interesting case, which is that it is a tool that we use so much, but we don't know anything about it. We don't have the language for it to understand it. And that to me, again, as an anthropologist who studies power, when you don't have the language for something, power is at work, right? And if it's something that we're using so often, and we don't know even how to talk about it, there's a reason for that. And part of what I try to do with this book, as well as with the graphic novella, is to really bring it to life through storytelling, to attempt to show people how is it that sanctions are actually working in a targeted society. Sanctions are unlike traditional warfare. You know, traditional warfare, a bomb is dropped and a photojournalist can take a picture of it or take a video of it and you can see it. Economic warfare, first of all, it spans over time and it's not something that's visible. And so how do we understand it is by paying very close attention to the experiences and the stories of the folks that have been living under sanctions for such a long period of time. Now, that also means that for some people, like I mentioned before, sanctions work really well, like the political and economic elites. And for others, they work really horribly, like especially women in societies that are sanctioned, because just like any other kind of warfare, women and mothers bear the brunt of the repercussions because they're the ones who are in charge of the bread baskets of their families. And so we're not saying throw the whole like baby out with the bathwater because that's not realistic in the environment that we're in. But we're saying, look, sanctions is a tool just like a scalpel is a tool in a surgery room, right? How do you use it? The current way that we're using it is not only causing all of this damage to the people and the societies that we are targeting, and actually empowering the states that we don't want to be empowered, but it is also creating all of this blowback. So, are there different ways to use this tool? That's a question for policymakers. The fact is, the policymakers weren't even having that conversation because we did not understand what was happening in a sanctioned country, which is part of the, you know, the reason that we've been doing the research that we've been doing and the outreach over it that we've been doing, because we want more than anything, as an educator, what I want more than anything is for people to ask questions and critical questions. And that is how sort of we get to this really brilliant question that they asked and start to sort of figure things like that out. But we can't even, if we don't have the language and the understanding, we can't even ask those kinds of questions.
So do you have a sense from your research, like, or just your own impression, why we keep doing it if we don't know how or if or why it's working? Is it just a sociological reason? Are we just assuming that it works, but it's what we've always done, so we keep doing it? Or is it just about looking strong? Like, do you have a sense of
Yeah, so
what's
part of
happening?
it is to look strong because, again, as I said, like it provides really nice headlines. You know, we say like such and such thing happened and we sanctioned, you know, the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, or we sanctioned these oligarchs in Russia. So one thing is for a domestic audience to say this is what we did to them, and that we have the power to do that because our economy and the U.S. dollar is so strong that we can do this, and this is a way of punishing them. But for example, like the Russia sanctions on oil and gas, Russia is continuing to sell oil and gas. They're just doing it in a roundabout way, right? So we also don't want to admit to the fact that sometimes our sanctions are not really actually working, like in the case of Russia's oil and gas. Because to admit that is to admit that our foreign policy is not working. That's a very difficult pill to swallow for a lot of folks. The other part of this is that sanctions, you know, you don't have troops who have been killed coming back home like you do in a war. And so it is seen as something that we are doing over there that has no repercussions on us. But actually, the sanctions regime on Venezuela and Cuba has led to huge migration waves, which actually ended up having an impact in this election because of, again, the migration crisis at the border. You now have, for the first time, Congress people along the Texas-Mexico border on both sides of the aisle saying that we need to reconsider our sanctions policies, especially on Venezuela and definitely on Cuba, because it's leading to huge migration waves in the same way that a hot war does. So it actually is having now an impact on our domestic politics. But again, the problem is that we haven't been talking about it. And I think the other reason that we haven't been talking about it, as I mentioned before, is that it's created by lawyers. It's really difficult to understand sanctions. It's really difficult to see what sanctions are doing. And there's an entire other sort of two things happen under a sanctions regime. One is that the country has to be made to be, as U.S. Sanctions policymaker Richard Nephew wrote in his book, The Art of Sanctions. He worked under both the under both the Bush II administration and the Obama administration. He said we had to make Iran special, but not in a good way. And what did he mean by that? He was talking about how prior to the Obama era sanctions on Iran, Japan and South Korea and European countries were trading with Iran. Iran was an important trade partner for them, especially for their energy needs. And they were not buying into the American pressure to sanction those countries. And so the United States had to create an entire discourse and narrative around the fact about how pariah and bad Iran was, or how evil Iran was, and therefore needed to become a pariah state. So there's an entire discourse that comes about through sanctions. You need to create an enemy of Iran, of Russia, more so than they have already been, in order to make it like no entity, no company, no country should want to touch it, right? It's like they're like toxic in this really horrible way. That is something that has to be created and sustained via media narratives, via language. And so when you have that, and this is part of the reason that I was saying sanctions are really easy to put on, but really hard to take off, because no folks in Congress or no president is going to come out and say, like, we're going to take all of the sanctions off of Russia or Iran or whatever because they're no longer evil. That's a big political risk that any politician is going to have to take, and they're not going to, because the discourse that has been created around these countries is such that we don't. And so we think Iran is evil, we think Russia is evil, and then therefore they are deserving of any act that we put on them, and sanctions is one of those acts. So we're going to economically attempt to strangulate them, but they deserve it. This also opens up a whole nother question, which we end our book with, which is a moral question, which is that if we know and we acknowledge that Iran's regime, Russia's regime, Venezuela's regime, Cuba's regime, these are all authoritarian regimes who suppress their populations. Sanctions is a tool that is primarily targeting the population, right? So under hot war, we're supposed to have international regulations and international law in which we're not supposed to allow the targeting of civilian infrastructure and all of those things. Now, forget the fact that that hasn't always and currently is not the case, but there are at least regulations on the book for these kinds of things. Under a sanctions regime, the population actually becomes the target. It's a moral question we need to be asking. We are suffocating the population in these countries, forcing them to rise up, and when they rise up, they're met with even more authoritarian repression. And that's we need to have some kind of discussion and regulation around that kind of moral question about this tool that we've developed.
I was trying to drop a link to your book quick in the chat. Your comments about kind of the mixed incentives were really interesting in the context of what you said about Cuba and Venezuela. Also, you really have to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. You now have competing incentives or competing motivations for trying to punish or not punish a country. It's probably difficult to keep both of those things in mind. Okay, question from Lorenzo, who is at Schuylkill Valley. If tariffs move away from the U.S. dollar, would they become a less effective non-war method? And is there an alternative option that we would move towards?
Yeah, I mean, the reason right now Trump can brandish about potential tariffs or tariffs in actuality is because of the size of the U.S. economy and the importance of the U.S. dollar. It's a lot harder for him to do this on an international scale in the way that he's attempting to do so if it's not done on the U.S. dollar. Now, maybe crypto becomes a thing that sort of replaces that, but I think one of the things to now, first of all, I have to say that crypto or any sort of currency like that is a possibility because now we have tech oligarchs at the forefront of our government here, or maybe our unelected government, and they're making the decisions and calling a lot of the shots. So that's something we have to be paying attention to, and the ways in which crypto might be, or these different kinds of currencies that are being developed might be sort of an alternative to that. But yet, nonetheless, those are also tied to certain interests. When we're thinking about the U.S. dollar, again, like I said, the reason that it's able to work, that Trump is able to make these kinds of threats, and that so far countries have been buckling under the threat of these kinds of tariffs, is because of the importance of the U.S. market and the importance of the U.S. dollar in international trade. It's a lot harder to be able to make those kinds of threats or demands when you're not the dominant currency for trade on a global scale.
And making the threats increases those countries' incentive to not let you be the dominant currency
Exactly.
on the U.S. market. Interesting. All right, David Carroll asks, could you expand on how political and expand on how the political and military elite become more wealthy under sanctions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, okay, when a country comes under sanctions, right? So it becomes so let's take Iran again. Iran comes under heavy sanctions. Doing any kind of trade with Iran to get goods in and out of the country. How do goods come in and out of the country? Right, they either get on ships or are transported over, but you need to have insurance for those goods, especially when they're in bulk amounts, like the amounts that a country needs to be able to do that kind of trade. You need to be able to have mechanisms to have the transaction actually happen. Like, how is the money going to get from an Iranian company to, like, let's say a European company or a Japanese company or wherever, an Indian company? It needs to go through some kind of mechanisms. When sanctions happen, those mechanisms become illegal. Like, you cannot actually using SWIFT, which is the predominant mechanism by which a lot of this transaction happens. SWIFT is no longer accessible for Iran and for trade with Iran. So then when an independent country would use when an independent business in these countries would use SWIFT or would use these insurance companies to do the trade that it needed to do in whatever it was trading in before, it is now cut off from those completely, and no other entity will engage in that kind of trade with Iran because it does not want to be sanctioned by the United States, right? So it's not going to put its own company at risk and give up the market of the United States in order to continue to trade with a country like Iran. So an independent business in a situation like this does not actually have the capital to continue to trade on the black market, because like anything else on the black market, like drugs on the black market, like any kind of goods on the black market, the price of it shoots up, right? So anything you get on the black market is more expensive than if you were to get that same good on a regular market that's sort of above the board. So over time, any independent business does not have the capital to be able to sustain trade at such high prices over long periods of time. So either those independent businesses have to begin to find out ways to tie themselves into the political and military elite, or they go bankrupt. Now, the political and military elite in a country do have the capital over time to be able to sustain this kind of trade. Why? Because they are sort of the monopoly owners over, and it's become more so under a sanctioned economy, become the monopoly owners over capital and trade of that country. So that means that if I were an independent business owner in Iran and I did under a sanctioned regime, I either have to figure out a way to tie myself into the political and military elite, or I make a choice not to do that, and I sort of have to give up my business, and I have to focus on something else if I was involved in international trade. the political and military elite of the country, especially the military elite, because again, they're the ones in charge of the borders of the country. So they are in charge of having goods come in and out, and then they get the kickback of having illegal goods come in. Illegal because it's been made illegal under sanctions to come in and out of the market. And they're also the ones who, for example, are doing the trade. So you had an instance a couple weeks ago, actually, in which these middlemen, Iranian middlemen, who were conducting trade between Europe and Iran illegally, okay, because it's been made illegal, they were caught up and put into prison in Italy. Elon Musk actually ended up negotiating, it seems, with the Iranian representative at the UN to get them released because Iran had taken an Italian journalist in Iran in order to pressure Europe to release this Iranian middleman, the businessman. That Iranian businessman, along many others who exist out there who are involved in this trade, they're tied into the political and military elite, and they're the ones who are acting as the middlemen, who are in essence in looking for trade routes that would allow these goods to continue to come in and out of the country. So this is sort of how sanctions busting functions, and this is why the political and military elites become the main drivers of the economy under a heavily sanctioned heavily sanctioned regime.
And you talked about how the effectiveness of tariffs is in part due to the strength of banking on the strength of the U.S. dollar. Is that true for all sanctions or tariffs specifically?
Yeah, no, it's true for sanctions um, because the main currency for trade in the world is the US dollar, right? And then like why did the British Empire what was the cause of the downfall of the British Empire? It was not just because the UK was losing its colonies. It was the downfall of the British Empire came once the British sterling pound stopped being the international currency. What makes the United States an empire? Yes, it's military bases around the world. Yes, the size of its military, but more importantly, it's the US dollar being the trade currency of the world. This is one of the reasons why Trump is reacting so harshly about uh, things like BRICS and and countries involved in BRICS and others who are attempting to create mechanisms that are parallel to the SWIFT that would allow for trade that do not include the U.S. dollar because he and others understand that once the US dollar stops being the predominant trade currency of the world, that's actually when US power globally really begins to decline. And this is why, you know, 3 years ago when we started this research, 4 years ago when we started this research, and I would talk about the potential blowback effect of the weaponization of the US dollar, people would smirk and laugh, and they're like, that's never going to happen. Now, and I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next year, but the increase of the weaponization of the dollar, it's logical that any country who's sitting and watching is like, well, I don't want my economy to be at the whims of somebody like a Donald Trump who may or may not like me right now, or may or may not like our country right now. And this is why, for example, when the Russia sanctions were put on under the Biden administration, one of the first things that happened was that Brazil and China decided to make their trade in local currencies because they did not want to be at the mercy of the weaponization of the dollar impacting their economies.
So then, just a quick follow up: are sanctions a tool of not countries other than the U.S.?
Yes, other countries can sanction. So the EU has had sanctioning capabilities. The UN as an institution has sanctioning capabilities. Other countries also, like sometimes, Iran will say, well, in response to that it's being sanctioned, will say, well, we're going to sanction these individuals but that doesn't really mean much when your currency is not such a predominant currency. Maybe in the future, China, if it begins to want to sanction, but it hasn't so far. And the European Union, now this is an interesting thing because the European Union actually was very much against Trump pulling out of the Iran deal when it happened when he was first in office. And the European Union tried to create a mechanism called Instex in which trade could continue to happen between Iran and sort of other companies in the world And yet the experience of that was that it actually couldn't get off the ground because the European Union, the euro was not able to, and Instex and sort of creating this mechanism was not able to actually do much in the face of U.S. sanctions. And so that one of the lessons learned for Iran and a lot of other countries in the region and others watching the sanctions regime was that actually if the U.S. decides to sanction unilaterally, which up until that point, there was this discussion that the US was going to always sanction multilaterally and not unilaterally. Trump actually showed that the US can sanction unilaterally and that Europe has no power at all. So the lesson learned for the Iranians as well as others in that instance was that Europe actually doesn't have much power, and that even when European states and companies want to continue to trade, when the U.S. is sanctioned unilaterally, they're sort of powerless in that instance.
That's all very interesting. So with respect to the dollar being the dominant currency, I mean, I remember hearing talk over the past 10 years about particularly the oil producing countries trying to get away from the dollar as the currency for trading oil, which then kind of by implication would demote it in the world as the predominant currency for business. And more increasingly, I think that movement, it was backed by China's Belt and Road Initiative. How is that effort related to sanctions, or is that kind of independent?
Um, so in some ways, for example, Saudi Arabia right now is really trying to do that with China. Um, I mean, the biggest thing is that the U.S. is, if not the largest, one of the largest oil producers and traders right now in the market. So the U.S. does not rely on the like oil from the Middle East in the same way that it did 30, 40 years ago. So that creates a certain kind of dent in that. The other thing is that the US then really pressures very hard because one of the things you have to understand about like US policy in the Middle East is that a big component of it was for questions of energy and oil and gas, right? And so anytime there's an inkling that some of these countries might start to trade in currency other than the US dollar, the United States puts a lot of pressure on them and has mechanisms to be able to do that. Many of these countries, defense industries are very tied into the American ones. Look at all the bases around the region. So there are ways in which the U.S. attempts to actually safeguard those moves from happening, but it kind of remains to be seen how that develops into the future. I think another big point of all of this is that no analysis of these things can remain true over time. Sanctions, the impacts that sanctions make is dynamic, right? So Iran today is different than Iran in 2018 when maximum pressure was put on. And it's different from 2013 when the Obama administration put sanctions on Iran to bring it to the negotiation table. So folks will say, well, sanctions works in 2013. Whether one agrees with that or not, I'm going to say let's just agree to that fact. But Iran today is different than 2013, right? And so because countries and decision makers learn from these experiences and then develop new policies either to safeguard their economies or to continue to sort of resist that kind of pressure and then create different kinds of trade routes. So this is a very sort of dynamic environment, and the fact that there's more international sort of resistance to sanctions today, at least in not only just in discourse, but in attempting to create mechanisms, that's different than what we had seen, for example, 5 years ago.
Excellent. So here's what I'm thinking. First, I'll apologize for the trouble we had getting people into the webinar. I'll make sure that everybody gets the recording so they can see this presentation. But why don't we wrap up by talking specifically about the book? You referenced it a couple times. Who is the book for, and where's the best place to get it?
Sure. So you can get the book on Amazon, Indie Shop, anywhere you get your books. It's called How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impacts of Economic Warfare. The book is we tried really hard. There's very little jargon in it. There's a lot of storytelling. It's really for a concerned public readership. So if you're really sort of thinking about American foreign policy, you're interested in understanding the things that are happening in the Middle East today, this is who we wrote it for.
All right, we did have one last question come in. Do you want it?
Yeah, sure.
All right, Warren, I think I mean, I know for a fact he's actually the president of the board of the World Affairs Council. Asked, did the sanctions on Russia prove more harmful for the Russian people or its oligarchs? And further, did they not have as meaningful an impact as the U.S. expected?
Yeah, they did not have as meaningful of an impact as the US expected. And Russia also, when it first attacked and took Crimea, also came under US sanctions. And so they've been inuring and sort of building infrastructure in their economy to try to prevent some of the direct costs of sanctions. It may have made life slightly more difficult for some of the oligarchs, but they find ways around it. It's pinched a little bit of the middle classes, but Russia has again the size of the Russian economy, the size of the Russian state is so much vaster than a place like Iran, right? And definitely than Cuba and Venezuela. But it's had an impact, but I think the greater impact has been on Russia now being at the forefront. Prior to Russia coming under these sanctions, it was Iran at the forefront of saying we need to build what they call a resistance economy to sanctions. Well, a lot of countries are like, okay, well, Iran, that's your problem. We're not paying attention to this. Russia, though, is a country that because of the size of its economy, the role that it plays in international politics, it's now very much at the forefront of trying to figure out and bring on countries to think about how you create mechanisms away from the US dollar.
All right, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Dr. Narges Bajoghli, we appreciate you spending the time to come talk to us today. On behalf of our members, thank you. For me personally, such a timely, relevant, important, interesting topic. I loved the presentation. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And for our members, I'll mention one last time, tomorrow at noon, at the McGlynn Center, we're having our rescheduled presentation from last week about the USAID. I hope I got that right. So we'll hope to see everybody there tomorrow. Thanks. Bye.